ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anthony, and I'm the host of the Strategic Minds podcast, which mission is to share the wisdom of the most strategically thinking people on planet Earth. For a long time, I have been interested in psychology, learning about humans' behavior and trying to understand it. And also politics, the world of influential people. I enjoy reading books that are thought-provoking, listening to podcasts, people that make me think, and talking to people who have different opinions, different perspectives, and or are more knowledgeable than me on certain topics that I like to discuss. And for those reasons, today's guest is Joseph DeVoir. We will talk politics, the war in Ukraine, the war in Palestine, upcoming president election, and also psychology. Hello, Joe, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Who are you, and what is your background?
Well, I'm your history teacher at the high school that we're currently filming in. But my background is mostly in humanitarian aid. My focus is in the Middle East, and my education is pretty diverse in terms of where I've studied, but I mostly studied the same thing: peace and conflict studies, humanitarian aid. A little bit of psychology involved in international relations, and a lot of history.
And I remember that in many lessons we talked about propaganda. So my question is, how does a person know if they are being influenced by propaganda?
I think that's a very easy question to answer and illustrate in this sort of current time that we're in. I think that a lot of times people assume that propaganda hits them from the enemy, that they have to beware of information coming at them from outside of their own country. So oftentimes you hear terms like Russian propaganda or Russian disinformation and things of that sort. I think, quite honestly, 99 to 100% of the propaganda that we're exposed to is coming from our own governments, our own societies, etc. So knowing when you are being exposed to propaganda is, first off, making the assumption that at least some of the information that you're receiving from the government or from mainstream media in a country would be propaganda. To find out exactly what that is, you have to vary your media diet. You have to look into several different sources, find ones that are credible, see where the story lines up between two credible sources, and see where it's wildly off. And then look for the motivation. What is the motivation for certain phrases or certain statements that are repeated over and over and over again? What is the point of that? Then I think it's pretty easy to understand when you're receiving propaganda. I can give some pretty simple examples from the current time period. The propaganda closely follows the alliances of the countries involved. In Denmark, we are very big supporters of Ukraine in this war. Mm-hmm. And very often the propaganda will work to characterize or mischaracterize the aims of Russia in the war and beyond. It will characterize or mischaracterize the strength of Russia today, before, and tomorrow. And it will do so in order to achieve what the state of Denmark wants, but not necessarily reflect the truth. Again, we were told many times that the economy of Russia is collapsing. That's simply not the case. So when you're faced with an untruth like that, do you say, well, the media made a mistake? Or do you think that they purposefully mischaracterized this to give us the impression that we were winning, that we were successful, and that we should continue? Mm-hmm. So for me, propaganda is not difficult to recognize, but it takes a lot of time to focus on 5 different newspapers or 6 different newspapers a day. And I'm lucky, I'm a history teacher, that's my job. But if I were a plumber, a carpenter, somebody else, it would be almost impossible to get out of that bubble in some ways without being able to invest enough time and energy into challenging what you're being given.
And I guess that it's also practice, that once you read the news, once you see how the propaganda looks like, and once you read what politicians say and how they speak, I guess it's no longer hard for you to recognize if it's propaganda or not.
In my case, I had a very brutal education in propaganda. So I lived in Palestine for nearly 9 years. And I held a weekly poker game in the city of Ramallah, which is the de facto capital of the Palestinian territories, and it's where all of the NGOs are, all of the journalists are, all of the UN agencies are, etc. It's the most comfortable city in the West Bank of Palestine. Mm-hmm. So because of that, I was able to interact with dozens of journalists from countries around the world, and Palestine is a place where there's an intense amount of media coverage. And having been there for so long and having established this sort of weekly social gathering, I would be often sitting around the table with not only national journalists from 4 or 5 different European countries at the same time. And they would be personal friends. And what was so brutal about my understanding of how the media works is that when you're on the ground, you can actually say, this happened. There were, for example, 6 bodies, or there was an explosion at 3:30, and you know that because you're there. You're counting it. You're not receiving this information passively through the media 6,000 miles away. Mm-hmm. And then that day you would watch the news in Denmark or South Africa or wherever, and my friends would be reporting it, and they would misreport it. And you could ask them to their face, why are you doing this? And they would tell you, this is our job. Our network is aligned in this direction. So while we will attempt to avoid lying, this is the position of the British government. So this will be the position of the BBC. This will be the position of Denmark's radio, if it is the position of the Danish government. And so facts and information that run counter to that narrative will simply be left out of the story. Now, for me, that was shocking at first, and of course, saddening for somebody who believes in international law and how important media is in making good decisions. I got to watch that scenario play out 50 times, where black was white and white was black, and I knew the people making the statements. So for me, it wasn't a matter of figuring out some deep and intelligent puzzle where I have this decoder ring or some special glasses that allow me to see. Yeah. I start out with the assumption now at this point. I'm deeply mistrustful of mainstream media, especially media funded by governments. And that would be the case whether I'm talking about China or a great democracy like Denmark.
So when you were speaking about the journalists and the politicians, these people often have to speak in public, of course. And so my question is, how do they balance personal beliefs with public opinions they have to adapt?
That's really easy. That was probably the rudest awakening that I'd experienced. My background was always in volunteering, and today I'm a volunteer. And I've always been active in my community, either through organizations like the Rotary Club or Lions Clubs or the church. And so when I got into humanitarian aid, I did so with the idea that obviously this is some sort of Mother Teresa style field where people are going in to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, this kind of stuff. And that obviously, to some degree, is the case. But then the reality sets in. And I can give a few very easy examples of what I mean, but the way that you compromise your ideals is the way you compromise your ideals in any organization. You try to get ahead. You try to climb the ladder. You try to gain more status and influence and salary. And to do so means drinking whatever Kool-Aid is required by the people at the top. They're not going to advance some sort of revolutionary. They're not going to hire somebody who's critical of the system that they serve or that, quite frankly, serves them in a way. So it becomes very easy. I've worked for organizations that do humanitarian aid, and some of the projects that they do have been either unnecessary or just plain absurd. Mm-hmm. But they'll do it because the money is in it. If we don't do this project, then we don't receive $22 million, and then none of us have a job this year. So we're going to do the project that the European Union wants, not that the people of Libya want or that the people of anywhere you're talking about want. And once you take that jump, it's very easy to do it over and over and over and over again. Yeah. And especially in that field, whether it's journalism or humanitarian aid, people are constantly getting pat on the back as if they're good. Like, oh, you're such a hero. You're such an important part of society because you're a tool of democracy in the case of journalism, or you're a do-gooder charity worker in the case of humanitarian aid. Well, number one, 99% of these people never work in the field, so they're never handing out rice or fixing houses. They're working on computers and they're finding grants and money from the EU. Number two, and this is the saddest part, nobody realizes they are very, 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 very well paid. I've had personal friends of mine who make $18,000 a month inside of a country where an average family makes $1,600 a year. They pay zero taxes on that income. They have multiple houses paid for by these organizations. They have, really? Of course. They also receive massive discounts when they go to the grocery store. They don't pay for gasoline. It gets absurd. And so the idea that it's all humanitarian goodwill of Mother Teresa that drives people forward have never met a UN worker who has Gucci glasses on and shoes that are more expensive than you can buy in Milan. And that's at the international level. And again, it's difficult to challenge these people, and it's easy for them to think they're good because everybody around them is patting them on the back. I know because I've been in that exact situation. The other side of it is local people. So let's imagine you're a very talented lawyer and you become a human rights lawyer and everybody thinks you're a hero, but in reality, I mean, you could probably make about as much money as that being a real lawyer. But now you're a Western lawyer but living in Bangladesh or something. So you're actually quite wealthy and you have a house with servants in it, etc. Well, that's you. You're an international working in Bangladesh. That's some sort of sacrifice to you, and you're making roughly the money you would make with your professional skills. In Bangladesh, on the other hand, if you're a local Bangladeshi working for Save the Children, you make more money than a medical doctor in Bangladesh. You make far more money than a stockbroker in Bangladesh.
Oh, yeah.
So in that sense, you could say, well, why would that work attract a do-gooder in the first place? Why wouldn't it attract the people that would go work for Goldman Sachs, who just want to make the most amount of money that they can in life? So those are some of the things that I would say about principle. And the same applies to journalists. I mean, they want to be on television. They want to be well known. And they learn very, very quickly that there's lines they can and cannot cross if they want to continue up the ladder. I'd also say that it's very easy to weed out decent, radical, or challenging people long before the hiring process or at the hiring process. So you're not going to have... It'd be very easy for me to fill a newsroom full of people who think like I want them to think already.
Right.
They don't feel like they're doing anything wrong. They feel like they're doing something right. So that would be my answer to that.
I asked that question because a lot of times when I read news or watch people on the internet or watch politicians speak, I often ask myself the question if that's really what they believe, or are they trying to advertise some false narrative? So what is the difference between advertising and propaganda?
Well, none. I mean, obviously, they're both trying to sell you something, an idea or even a product. I think that this conversation is exhausting, but very normal. It's how can I know what I'm finding online is true, right? And that's everybody's question, and it's everybody's, why can't I find that source of information that has what I need and I can trust it and I can invest 25 minutes a day and get all that I need from the world? You can. It just takes work. So you can find sources that are reliable, and I have some very easy pointers on how to do that. And it's not about doing massive amounts of background information on where this person went to school or what they studied or who they worked for, who pays them. On issues that matter, there are people who've paid a genuine price to tell the truth. And those are people that you can trust going forward, at least more than you can trust somebody who's gotten paid lots of money to tell you something. In my lifetime, there's a lot of people like this. Edward Snowden gave up his life in America, gave up his wife, gave up his freedom to tell the truth about something. Now he lives in Russia, right? And he's thousands of documentaries about the heroism of this person, and they have clearly sacrificed a very good life to tell the truth. You have countless people like that, and you have to find them. They're screaming out all of the time in alternative media, and they are excluded from the mainstream. I can think of another really obvious example for me is probably one of the greatest living humans when it comes to the world of international peace and humanitarian aid and development and diplomacy, and that is Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. He has and continues to advise almost every government on planet Earth. He has turned around dozens of economies. He has worked voluntarily as a special representative for the United Nations for 36 years, which is one of the highest positions you can get, and he has done so for free. And he's created some of the UN's biggest programs. So he is the guy that created the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. He's headed up countless UN commissions on everything from coronavirus origins and responses to the war in Libya, to changing currencies, etc. This gentleman has a resume that goes on for days and days and days and days and days, and a track record of success. You won't hear him in the news ever, but he speaks every day, and you can listen to him every day. So these types of individuals are out there. Another one that we could mention when it comes to, again, things like people who've paid the price, one that's known internationally very well is Julian Assange. WikiLeaks has never been found to have printed a false story, and he spent years and years and years and years and years of his life in jail, far away from his family, his physical health broken down. And then you juxtapose that with some smiling, slick person in a studio with lots of lights on them in a suit, and they're spitting out the same information and talking points as you heard by the person before. That's the difference. One is benefiting from their words, and one is paying a huge price. And in my experience, that's not 100% going to be that means they're correct, but it's a damn good indicator that somebody's telling the truth when it dramatically hurts them to do so.
Yeah.
So that would be my advice on that.
Would you like to meet them?
Those people?
Yeah.
No, not necessarily. Well, it comes to somebody like Jeffrey Sachs or John Mearsheimer or some of these great academics or actors. Yeah, I'd like to. I have no real desire to meet Edward Snowden, for example. I think he, again, guys like them continue speaking on a regular basis. I've probably listened to enough Jeffrey Sachs to feel like I know him already. Anyways, we start to get their cadence down and listen to them enough, you kind of know what they would say in the first place. But if I did, I would say thanks. Good work. You could be a billionaire. You could drink the Kool-Aid. You could convince the world that everybody's right because you have the credibility to do so, and you could. But instead, you try to do your best and try to help. So that would be.
Would there be a question you would like to ask him?
No, I think he's being asked the right questions, like I said, every day.
Okay.
I listen to a lot of different podcasts. I think, obviously, the news is pretty horrible when it comes to getting information, and that's because of the structure of the news. If you have 2 minutes, how are you going to break down a complex history of countries like Israel and Palestine or Ukraine and Russia? It becomes more about talking fast and making quick, catchy points, but not any real information. So podcasts, 2-3 hours, where intellectuals can speak and sit down and explain themselves and go through these are PhDs, so they're not good at saying things in 2 words, but they're really good at saying things in 8,000 words. So yeah, there's plenty of really high quality information out there, and plenty of good journalists asking them questions, but they're going to be doing so just like we're doing right now, instead of in some studio getting paid $35 million an hour. They would be paid by people who support their work and think it's valuable and donate money. And it's the future.
You mentioned that you lived more than 5 or 10 years in Palestine.
A little less.
Yeah, a little less. So how would the deal between Israel and Palestine look like if they would want to end the war?
To end this war, or the whole thing?
The whole thing and this war.
I think that it's a really, really complex situation at this exact moment. And there's so much fog of war at this exact moment that a lot of what I would be saying would seem like speculation about especially Hezbollah and Israel and what's coming tomorrow and how it ends. In terms of Israel and Palestine and Israel and the broader Middle East in general, I don't think the answers are difficult at all and haven't been for half a century. And I'm not saying that because I'm clever, and I'm not saying that because I have insider information. I'm saying that because the broad outlines of a peaceful two-state solution have been on the table and are very, very well known by everybody on planet Earth that cares to know about them. Mm-hmm. And these revolve around what they call final status issues. And so things like, where does the border go between these two states? What happens with Jerusalem? What happens with the refugees from previous conflicts? What happens with water? And these issues have been talked about and discussed not only by Israelis and Palestinians, but literally millions of internationals and thousands of organizations and what feels like billions of lawyers at this point. We're talking about a space of land that most people on Earth don't really comprehend how tiny it is. It would be slivers in most countries, and certainly in mine, it would be a sliver of a state, the entire thing that we're talking about. So when I say that it's very widely known, I mean that these plans have some of them down to the inch of territory, and these have been around and on the table for, again, decades and decades, and sometimes they're pushed, and sometimes there's summits where these things go forward in peace conferences. And does that mean it's completely easy and there's nothing left to negotiate? No, there is, and there are some things, but we know exactly what they are. And in general, if you listen to the media, they'll just tell you this conflict has gone on for thousands of years. It's so complicating. It'll never end. And that's very, very insane way to see it. And it's also not helpful, but it's inaccurate. That's not the genesis of this conflict. Isn't biblical times or things like that. Mm-hmm. So to answer the question very easily, why haven't we arrived at this peace that the world claims to want? The United Nations is meeting right now today and talking exactly about this thing. And over and over and over again, they'll say we want a two-state solution for Palestinians and Israelis. The answer is the United States support. The U.S. supports Israel. Israel has bigger ambitions than those deals allow for. Their borders are bigger in their mind. Part of this is political. It's a stronger and more powerful state if it takes certain resources, especially water. But I think most of it is ideological and religious. There's one crazy irony about Israel and Palestine is that when the Jews came largely from Europe and different parts of the Middle East to populate Israel in large waves after World War II, they were settled in, or they settled in, and the United Nations eventually outlines plans where they're living in territories that are not the most important territories to Jewish religious life and history. Mm-hmm. So the places that are called Palestine, or the West Bank specifically, is home to some of the most significant historical religious sites in Judaism. So there's an ideological pull from a large part of Israeli society to continue to expand. And there's a political and economic pull to continue to expand into places like the West Bank. And that means not accepting a peace process that stops that expansion. Over the time I was there, which is difficult to actually characterize, because when you work in Palestine, you were not allowed to stay there. So I wasn't allowed to be there for 9 months. I had to leave, or 9 years, because Israel knows what you're doing and they control everything.
Oh.
So when you go through the airport, you'll receive a 1-week visa, 1-month visa, maybe a 3-month visa, which is the best you can get. And then you're there for 3 months, and then you have to leave, go to another country, come back in. Hopefully you get a 3-month visa. I'd usually fly to Barcelona or Cyprus or something like that. But if you leave and come back the next day, the passport counter kind of looks at you funny. So maybe they go from a 3-month visa to a 1-week visa. And then you go back to work and you tell your boss you have to leave again. But this time you have to leave and get a new passport, because you can't have that 1-week visa and expect to get a 3-month visa. So now you're flying back to America for a month and a half, and then maybe you'll be back at work. So it was very incredibly difficult
I can imagine.
to do what you're doing. And this is the case when I was working with Oxfam, Save the Children, some of the largest international organizations in the world. The only time the Israeli government couldn't kick me out or deny me entry was when I worked for a high school funded by the U.S. government. In that case, I was given basic visa rights. So there's a huge amount of support for Israel from the world's biggest superpower, and it's unending support, seemingly. It's not conditioned. And there's no reason in that scenario for Israel to accept a peace that doesn't meet their exact objectives. And I think that's pretty straightforward. The United Nations has called the war in Gaza genocide. They've demanded that it end. The United States has blocked every single thing at the Security Council to do so. Last week, the United Nations General Assembly declared that Israel is an illegal occupation of Palestine and must withdraw and create a Palestinian state. That was blocked by the United States. So the number of resolutions and the number of times where the world has tried to say, all right, let's get this over with. It's the U.S. that blocks it. It has a veto power. Take 2 minutes on the internet and you could probably count literally hundreds of times that this has happened. So I don't think it's that difficult. I don't think it's complicating to understand the dynamics of it. I don't think that Israel could continue to do what it's doing without unlimited U.S. support. And I think that if we were to condition that dramatically, Western support in general, that it would require Israel to sit down and negotiate a just and lasting peace with all of its neighbors. And that doesn't mean abandoning Israel. It means being at their side at the negotiating table for something that lasts more than a month and more than a few days, but no longer making this about war and conflict.
Do you think anything will change by the next U.S. president election?
Yeah, I think that this is a time for everybody in the world to hold their breath. I really do. I think that some common phraseology in America is the October surprise. The election's in November, and something's going to happen in October. So what will the October surprise be? We shall see. We have all sorts of things happening right now which are dramatic. We have the Danish Prime Minister yesterday called basically for all-out war with Russia. She called for the obliteration of Russian red lines, in her exact words. There's a big push from England, and at this very moment the United States is not supporting it, but there's a big push for England to bring long-range missiles into the Ukrainian army and allow them to shoot them into Russia. According to Russia, that would mean war with NATO, and they've said it very openly. There is currently a massive acceleration of violence and tension in the Middle East and the number of players involved is complex. We're not just talking about Hamas and Israel or Hezbollah and Israel. We're also now starting to talk about the Lebanese army, the Syrian army, the Houthis, the Iranians, large numbers of countries coming together as a coalition to possibly expand this war dramatically. Now, besides death and destruction, any major war in the Middle East where Middle Eastern countries are cooperating, you're also talking about economic disaster if they were to choose to close down major shipping hubs, play with energy markets, etc. So there is a whole lot of things that can go wrong at this exact moment. There's a whole lot of interests all over the world in making things go wrong. There's a lot more money in war than there is peace. And while peace does pay dividends, as you say, those are longer term, and those are spread much more evenly out through society. The money that's being made now is being made by small handfuls of people and by the hundreds of billions. So there are huge incentives for very powerful organizations, institutions, and states for the violence to continue. And because of that, the idea that it can be managed so that it doesn't tip over into some scary scenario is less and less likely. Of course, they would like to keep everything under control and have everything at some sort of tipping point, but never falling off the brink, so to speak. But that becomes less and less easy to manage as things become more and more complex and chaotic.
What do you mean by chaotic in this sense?
Well, about a week ago, I think, my brain gets a little addled when it comes to times and dates of current news. But about a week ago, Israel carried out a massive operation involving mobile pagers, walkie-talkies, and laptop computers. This is being widely condemned as a massive act of terrorism. And I'm not talking about condemned by Hezbollah or Iran. We're talking about the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights has called this a massive war crime and a massive act of terrorism that needs to be prosecuted. And countries across the world, even some that are very huge allies of Israel, have stated the same. Not only does that demand some sort of response and escalation, which we're seeing play out right in front of our eyes as we speak, it has possibly opened up a massive Pandora's box into how we are allowed to fight each other. This was not only a simple act of indiscriminate targeting that included lots and lots of civilian government workers, rather than what is talked about as merely striking Hezbollah fighters or terrorists or something like this. We have hundreds of videos of these things going off in hospitals, phone shops, etc. Think about the Pandora's box that's opened by the idea that we can now use consumer products as bombs. Think about what would have happened if that had been an iPhone rather than a pager. I mean, nobody owns pagers anymore. These are something that were around before you were born. I can remember them, but
Pager.
yeah, it was a basic caller ID system. But think if it had been a consumer product that everybody around the world buys and loves.
A different story.
Well, maybe next time. Or maybe countries around the world who are adversarial to the West or who may one day be adversarial to the West, why would they trust our consumer electronic products now? A country has turned them into a bomb. So the implications of some of these things that are going on as we speak are really hard to unravel. I mean, oftentimes I over the last 20 years of being very interested in politics, I've often felt like I have a grasp of what's going on and could sit down and explain that to people in a way that makes sense. Just like the King of Jordan said yesterday at his UN speech, this is unlike anything before. There's so much and so many moving parts, and they are independent and interconnected at the same time. So we could see a peace deal in Ukraine in 2025, and we could see a regional or global war break out in the Middle East, or vice versa. Or we could see the expansion of both of these along almost Cold War lines, where they're divided up and America and the West are on one side and China and Russia are on the other. Mm-hmm. Or we could see some global detente where Russia and America and China and the broader NATO membership sit down and pound out some sort of longer-term solution. All of these things are possible, including nuclear war. And I think that that's not hyperbole at all. I don't think that that's exaggeration at this moment. And both the United States and Russia are, at the very least, preparing for it. And that's terrifying.
How come when it comes to the war in Palestine, U.S. has more power than United Nations?
The UN doesn't have any power without all of the active Security Council members. The United Nations is headquartered in New York. It was created largely by the United States, and the United States funds roughly 25% of all the UN activities. Now, we're one country out of 193 inside of the UN. So that gives you an idea of its power, and the fact that the UN is sitting in New York City and all the world's diplomats are there right now, again, gives you an idea of its power. Yeah. What people don't know is that the United States is not allowed to join organizations that are more powerful than the United States, which I'm a big supporter of, that idea of sovereignty, by the way. The United States has something called Article X or Article 10, which same thing occurred with the League of Nations. You cannot sign up Americans to a body that can control America. Only Americans and their votes control the United States of America. So in order for the U.S. to be part of the UN and for us to play this role, we were given a monopolistic veto power along with 4 other countries. So that's how. The UN is only powerful if everybody wants it to be powerful, and it's absolutely useless if that's what you want it to be.
Mm-hmm. When we go back to the U.S. president election, how do you view Kamala Harris' election after Biden stepped down?
On the one hand, it's not surprising. On the other, it's a little bit frustrating for people. I'll talk about people who would either support Biden or Democrats in general. I think that's more relevant. Kamala Harris ran for president in 2020 and did horribly. She did so badly that she didn't make it to the first primary vote, which is this place called Iowa, where they typically vote. So she was sitting well under 2%, and this was with a huge amount of media pushing her forward. So on the one hand, there are a lot stronger candidates on that side that would be doing far better than she is against Donald Trump. That's first. On the other hand, and this year they also did a primary as well. In 2024, Joe Biden went and got the Democrats to re-elect him as the head of the party. So they had a choice of doing that again. They had a choice of running a primary and finding the best candidate based on the votes of the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. And they didn't. They gave it to her. And we will see how that goes. She obviously has a lot of support in the media, and she's much more popular than Joe Biden. He was looking pretty rough by the end of his term, even though he is technically still president. And that's in some ways terrifying and weird that he's not seen as healthy enough to be running for president, but he's healthy enough to currently be president, and perhaps one of the scariest, most tense times in recent history. So Kamala Harris doesn't have a lot of huge support, I would say, for Kamala Harris and what she stands for. I don't think a lot of people know what that is. Kamala Harris has a huge amount of support from people who do not like Donald Trump and will not like Donald Trump. And I think that that's a very different thing. So she's not necessarily selling a platform or a set of clear ideas or policies that would set her apart from either Joe Biden or Donald Trump. She's very unclear about that. This is an election between people who support Donald Trump and those who do not. So I think that that's an important thing to think about. In general, I think she's a very weak candidate. I think that she was selected because you could not move all of the money from the Biden campaign into another name. That was illegal under the law, and so in order to keep the hundreds of millions of dollars that had already been raised for the election, they had to keep her name on the ticket. Secondly, she's the acting vice president, so she was going to be the first in line in general. Yeah. But in terms of her popularity, she's a much weaker candidate than the Democrats could have fielded.
Why then do some people so strongly support Donald Trump?
I think Donald Trump is supported by large numbers of people and far larger than is recognized by, I would say, 99% of European media or commentary on the topic. It's often kind of weird to talk about Trump in general because people have such strong opinions and their minds made up, and they like to fill or project their ideas of Trump and their fears onto others, in some cases where they don't exist. So there are a lot of people that support Trump for very obvious and clear reasons. Number one, he had a dramatic impact on the economy, and it was surprising to me. I was very skeptical of Donald Trump and have always been a progressive Democratic voter most of my life, because the Democrats have typically been the party pushing for peace in most of my life. So for me, when I was watching Trump's election and he's talking about, I'm going to make this the biggest and the best and the biggest and the best, it sounded so stupid. And over the course of only a couple of years, we had dramatic economic growth, dramatic. And it was obvious both here in Denmark, but I could watch it in America as well, and especially where I'm from in Michigan, where industry started to return. Michigan is about as far from Mexico as you can get, so a lot of people talk about Trump in this sort of vein of immigration, which is important to people in Michigan and in Texas and other places, but there's often this pigeonholing of Trump supporters as being dumb, nativistic, ethnocentric, racist, however you want to talk about it. But I think for 99, well, no reason to put a number on it, but I think for the vast majority of people who go to vote, they look at their wallet, they think about how their wallet looked 4 years ago, and they think about how it looks now, and they think about how they'd like it to look 4 years from now, and then they go vote. For me, the biggest surprise of Trump and the reason I would support Trump's candidacy in 2024 is foreign policy. I am not a person that is heavily invested in the environmental movement or the human or civil rights movements broken down by each society, whether it's racial or sexual lines, etc. I am not somebody that sits around focusing on a bunch of different issues that are very important to other people, like abortion or immigration. I am a single issue voter, and that is largely foreign policy and my country's role in making this world a better place or making this world a more violent place. And I'm always very surprised at the hatred and fear of Trump when I talk to people, because there's one thing that's undeniable. There's one thing that he said he was going to do and did more than any president of my lifetime or even my father's lifetime, and that was pursue peace, end wars, and not begin new wars. There aren't any presidents in American history who have done that and committed themselves to that. And if you're somebody like me that likes to stop seeing American bombs dropping all over the world, that was a pretty quiet 4 years. Donald Trump assassinated an Iranian general. That was provocative, maybe even illegal and other things. But compared to the 7 wars under the Obama administration, the absolutely crumbling world we're witnessing around us now, and many, many, many smaller conflicts and coups involving the United States underneath the Biden administration. Support for Donald Trump has a lot to do with bringing American soldiers and weapons and money home to America, where they can build bridges and fund schools, rather than the literally hundreds and hundreds of bases that we have around the world. So for a lot of people, those are the issues that matter. And they're not worried about the things that other people are worried about. And that doesn't mean those things don't matter. If you're a voter that is very concerned about abortion, then for you this is a very clear election, and you'll make a decision as easily and comfortably as I will, based on something like foreign policy, and that's your prerogative and your right. But if your concern is international peace and the end of a lot of the chaos we spoke about earlier, I think that this election is either going to be a choice between more of the same, which is escalation, or something dramatically different. whether Trump is telling the truth or not. Compare Meta Frederickson's speech about obliterating all Russian red lines and bringing NATO directly into the conflict in Ukraine versus Donald Trump's promise to end the war in 24 hours because there's too many young kids dying, and that escalation will lead to nuclear war. If I'm somebody choosing between broadly these two positions, which I think we are, then it's a pretty easy vote.
How would Donald Trump act to stop the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think that everybody should already understand this, and it's an example of how corrupted and twisted our media is. But at the start of this war and long before this war, there have been outlines about how to bring this conflict to an end. And this conflict doesn't start between Russia and Ukraine. It starts between Ukraine and Ukraine. There's an ongoing civil war in Ukraine that started in 2014. Russia intervened in that civil war. And whether they're doing so legally or morally, that's not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm talking about is the solution. I'm not interested in getting into an ethical debate. Right after, or right before, or in the years after this civil war began, there was an international agreement and then a second one called the Minsk Accords, which were overseen by Europeans, by Germany and France, which would bring about a recognized autonomy of the Donbass region within Ukraine and an end to the fighting inside of this place. After the war began, there was immediately negotiations in Minsk, Belarus. During those negotiations, which didn't end successfully, the Ukrainian negotiator was killed by Ukrainian Secret Service, and that is widely reported and was at the time as well. Following that, a few months later, we had a document that was many, many, many pages long, and each of them signed and initialed by Ukrainians and Russians, and this was signed in Istanbul, which would bring an end to the conflict. The document was 1.5 inches thick of paperwork, and it went through everything: what happens with Ukraine and NATO, what happens with these regions, which parts are returned, and on and on and on. And Ukrainian negotiators signed that document. And NATO and President Biden, represented through Boris Johnson, flew to Istanbul and told the Ukrainians not to sign the document. And this is all well documented by a number of leaders there at the time, including the Israeli negotiator, who pointed this out very clearly, and now it's been widely recognized that we said, if you go in, we don't need to negotiate. The sad tragedy of that is, of course, that the terms of those negotiations in places like Minsk and Istanbul will never be returned to again by Russia. That after so much death and destruction, why would we go back to what we offered years ago? We're winning. And that's very sad. But it doesn't mean there's not a chance forward, and it doesn't mean that there aren't rough outlines of how this gets solved, and it doesn't mean that there aren't rational and irrational Russian demands, and there aren't rational and irrational Ukrainian demands, and we can parse these out to come to a solution. The alternative is horrible. The alternative is the destruction of the Ukrainian state, an ongoing asymmetric guerrilla warfare of what remains between Russia and Ukraine, perhaps, or a global conflict that brings in NATO and Russia. There is no alternative where Ukraine wins the war. I've never understood how that has been played in the media. We are well aware that Russia doesn't just possess nuclear weapons, they have the largest nuclear arsenal on planet Earth. And they have declared from the very beginning that this is an existential conflict that they will not lose. So the only scenario that I could possibly imagine Ukraine winning this war over the last 2.5 years is what the West initially tried to do. We're not actually going to defeat Russia militarily. We're going to create a scenario in which the Russian government collapses and a new, more pro-Western government takes its place. But the idea, the stupidity of believing you're going to destroy the state of Russia, which has the capacity to destroy all of planet Earth and the moon, by the way, is kind of foolish. And that foolishness has existed in European and American media for 2.5 years now. And in what scenario does Russia allow its government to be overthrown, or its capital cities and major infrastructure to be bombed, without at some point responding with the weapons that its constitution says must be used in these scenarios? So the idea that there was ever going to just lay down is dangerous. The United States is not going to let a foreign power overthrow its government and put in one that's more pro-Russian or more pro-Chinese. We'll blow up the earth and the moon before that happens. The United States won't allow an aggressive, heavily armed neighbor to be near us. I think we've gone through enough examples to prove that that's the case in our own history class. So to expect that behavior from a country that actually has more destructive capacity than America is interesting. I don't know how else to describe it.
Who do you think will win the upcoming USA president election?
I think that the American elections are the most exciting sporting event in the world. I love getting into the numbers. I love getting into the speculation, and I think it's accurately described as a horse race often. If I had to make a prediction right now, I would guess that Trump wins the White House through the Electoral College and narrowly loses the popular vote. Recently, a huge number of polls have come out in the states that matter. It doesn't matter how many Americans vote for one or the other. It's an electoral college system, as everybody is probably aware at this time. So the states that matter are states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and small districts in places like Nebraska and Maine. So those numbers have come out with wild reversals over the last couple of weeks' polls and in Trump's favor. And these are by polling agencies which are well respected. There's a lot of polling agencies that aren't, and there's a lot of games that can be played with polls.
What is polling agency?
Polling agency is the organizations that collect data on how many people would vote this way or how many people would vote that way. I'll give you an example of how it works in America. A polling agency can make any result that they want. It's always imperfect. So I'm going to tell you what 370 million people think because I'm going to call the right 9,000. Right? Now, already you can see the problem. Now, who are those 9,000? Are they old people? Are they young people? Am I contacting them by telephone, mobile telephone, computer survey, etc.? How many people are black, white, Hispanic, Indian, how many people have strong political opinions going into it, how many of them do I include from one side to the other side, etc. There's millions of ways in which you can game these polls to tell you what you want. And that's why Trump has polls that will say he's up 20, and Kamala Harris will have polls that say they're up 20, and they put those into the media in an effort to try and push people in that direction. On the other hand, there's some really good pollsters, and they're really good because they have a track record of being very good over the course of the last few elections. And in America right now, the most important pollsters are the ones who can capture Trump support. That's very hard to do. Trump people don't trust the media. They don't trust polls. So you can call them and say, hey, who are you going to vote for? And they'll say, shut up. And they'll hang up the phone. Well, that becomes a non-answer, right? Because they don't trust what you're going to do with these polls. And there's also, I think people have to understand this, there's a lot of taboo and social stigma associated with saying I support Trump or I support the right wing. And this is throughout America and this is throughout Europe. So why am I going to pick up the phone to a stranger and tell this stranger information about myself that's not positive? It'll make them think less of you. I mean, if you think of the common stereotypes of Trump voters, they're dumb and they're racist. And why would I want to associate with that? So he'd call me on the telephone and say, who are you going to vote for? And I'll say, goodbye. Don't ever call me again. And instead of that being registered as a Trump vote, which I bet you about 99% of the time it is, that gets registered as non-support or nothing. Mm-hmm. So you've got agencies that have a proven track record of being much, 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 much closer than others. In the Electoral College in the last election, in a place like Pennsylvania, Donald Trump lost by 48,000 votes. That is less than, a few tenths of a percent of the vote. The polling agencies had Trump losing by 8%. So they were very off. 7.9, 7.8% points away from capturing Trump support. Now the question is, especially for anybody gambling at this point, is how much have they corrected that error from 2020 or 2016 to now? Mm-hmm. Because the polls are always underestimating Trump by 4 or 5 percentage points from what he actually does on the election. Mm-hmm. Several polls have come out this week shockingly saying that, and again from some decent polling agencies, that Trump is winning nationally, not just the Electoral College, but for the first time tied or 1 or 2 points above Kamala Harris in the popular vote. Again, we'll see how that shakes out, and there's polls that say the opposite of that, and so we'll see how it shakes out. If I had to guess, though, I'd tell you my opinion. I think he'll win the Electoral College, and I think she'll win the popular vote.
Okay, amazing. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
And that was it for today's episode. I hope that, like you have learned something new about psychology, power, politics, wars, and in general, how does the world work. I also hope that this podcast made you think, that you have heard information and opinions that are thought-provoking, that you can also discuss with your family, friends, and anyone you would like to. And please do, because it will make you a smarter person. If you want to be on the next episode of Strategic Minds, please message me on my Instagram or on the Instagram of Strategic Minds. Thank you. Stay safe.